Thank you so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you so much for inviting me and for all of you being here. I think it's especially appropriate, as Huwaida mentioned, that we're having this conversation on the 76th anniversary of the signing of the Genocide Convention. And also, as Huwaida mentioned, tomorrow is International Human Rights Day. One of the things I learned through the research that I conducted was that Article 13.2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says everyone has the right to leave their country and to return to their country. And the reason why this article was put into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is because when it was being written and adopted in December of 1948, that was being done against the backdrop of Israel's dispossession of the Palestinian people from their land, what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba in Arabic, or catastrophe. And in this process, Israel drove from their homes a vast, vast majority of the indigenous Palestinian population, which lived in Palestine at the time and that became Israel. So Israel pushed out of their homes about 80% of the indigenous population that lived there before Israel was established in 1948. Israel destroyed hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns and cities, razing them to the ground, sometimes repopulating them with Israeli Jews. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all of the liberal human rights-based infrastructure of the post-World War II international order was taking place against the backdrop of Israel's settler colonial dispossession of the indigenous Palestinian people. In addition to these two commemorations that Huwaida mentioned, also a few days ago on November 29th, we also marked the 77th commemoration of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. And that Day of Solidarity refers back to the 1947 recommendation by the United Nations General Assembly to partition Palestine against the wishes of its majority indigenous Palestinian inhabitants for the benefit of a minority settler colonial regime. And one thing that I learned through the research that I conducted in the archives was that Palestinians repeatedly, cogently, very forcefully, and articulately stated their claim to self-determination at the United Nations when these debates were happening about the future of Palestine in 1947. I want to share with you a remark by Jamal al-Husseini, who was the vice chair of what was called the Arab Higher Committee. This was the representative body of Palestinian Arabs who made the case for Palestinian self-determination at the United Nations more than 3/4 of a century ago. Here's what he said in September of 1947, quote, "The Palestine Arab case is simple and self-evident. Indeed, it hardly needs elaboration. It's based on the high principles of international justice, which are upheld by the civilized world. It is that of a people who desire to live in undisturbed possession of their country, in which they have continually existed and with which they have become inextricably interwoven." So as Palestinians made this case for their self-determination to be respected and for their country not to be partitioned against their will for the benefit of a foreign minority settler colonial movements, the US had no answer to that. The United States could not articulate a principled reason why Palestine should be partitioned against the wishes of the majority of the indigenous population who lived there. And in fact, the State Department described it as a policy based on, quote, expediency to support the partition of Palestine. But one thing that the United States noted was that this was only a recommendation coming from the United Nations. It didn't have the force of law. So the United States actually recognized that Palestine could only be partitioned if it was done peacefully and if it was done consensually, meaning that Palestinians had to agree to it. So when it became clear that Palestinians would not accept the partitioning of their country in 1947, this is very important. The United States actually backed off the idea of partitioning Palestine. And they said because this violates Palestinian self-determination, that the Palestinian people don't agree to the partitioning of their country, we can't enforce this. So instead, in March of 1948, the Truman administration actually tried to turn the matter back over to the UN and hold Palestine as a trusteeship until a fair and a just resolution could be worked out between the indigenous majority Palestinian people and the Zionist settler colonial movement. And this was the policy that the Truman administration actually pursued all the way up until the end of the British rule over Palestine in May of 1948. Now, I'm not trying to whitewash the positions of the United States. In fact, they come in for quite a lot of condemnation for immediately recognizing the state of Israel, despite the fact that the United States recognized that declaring statehood was not the best outcome. They also but they also deserve a lot of condemnation for refusing to sanction Israel at the United Nations in 1948 as Israel continued to drive out the Palestinian people from their homes in violation of repeated Security Council resolutions and calls for ceasefire. And also, the United States deserves condemnation for not compelling Israel to take back Palestinian refugees who were exiled from their homes by Israel, despite the fact that you had this written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But why is this history important? Because we have to ask ourselves a question: was the United States in 1947 and in 1948 as complicit in Israel's attempt to erase the presence of the Palestinian people as the United States is today? And I would say unequivocally, the answer is no. Today, the United States is much, much more deeply complicit, and you can make the argument the United States is actually a partner in crime to Israel's genocide that's taking place in Gaza right now. If you look back at history, in 1948, the United States did not send one single bullet to Israel to inflict the Nakba on the Palestinian people. In fact, the reverse is true. The United States imposed an arms embargo on Palestine in 1947 and prevented anyone from receiving weapons. And this was held as a firm policy against the insistence of the Zionist movement. Not one bullet was sent to Israel during the Nakba. We've seen the Biden administration shamefully use its veto power in the Security Council resolutions, in the Security Council, excuse me, on four separate occasions to veto ceasefire resolutions. 1 second, excuse me. My apologies, I'm dealing with a little cold. The Biden administration has vetoed Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire on 4 different occasions since October 2023. On the other hand, if we look at U.S. policy in 1948, the Truman administration actually wrote, drafted, supported 11 different Security Council attempts to get Israel to stop fighting and stop driving Palestinians from their homes. And the Truman administration never, ever supported what Israel did in terms of driving Palestinians from their homes and exiling them. But we've seen repeatedly how the Biden administration has provided Israel not only with the diplomatic means, but with the actual weapons to drive over 90% of Palestinians from their homes in the Gaza Strip, repeatedly forcing them to flee into safe zones that have not been safe at all and have been subject to Israeli attacks. The United States was deeply, deeply concerned by what Israel did to the Palestinian people in 1948. I want to leave you with a quote from a person by the name of Mark Etheridge. He was the U.S. representative to a body that was established by the United Nations at the tail end of 1948, called the Palestine Conciliation Commission. The Palestine Conciliation Commission was supposed to, among other tasks, allow Palestinian refugees who had been forced from their homes in what became Israel to return to those homes in conjunction with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here's what Mark Etheridge, the U.S. representative on that body, said in February of 1949. He said, quote, "I'm afraid that the Jews have learned too much in terrorism from the masters who taught it to them, Germany, Poland, and Russia. And hearing some of the reports that Mark Etheridge sent back to President Truman about the dire status of Palestinian refugees, whose status in 1948 was incredibly similar to the horrific conditions that Palestinians are facing in the Gaza Strip today, Truman himself pronounced himself, quote, disgusted with Israel's treatment of Palestinians being driven from their homes. So we have a second Trump administration coming in right now, and we've seen how extremist Israeli government ministers have been hatching plans to recolonize Gaza and also to formally annex the West Bank. This should drop any pretensions of any Israeli desire for there to be any form of any type of Palestinian state in any small portion of historic Palestine. Clearly, Israel has taken the steps to make a two-state resolution, if it were ever just at all, and we can have a conversation about that, impossible and not feasible. So we're at an inflection point in history where not only do we have to end the genocide that's taking place, but we have to reconceptualize what it means for there to be a just and lasting resolution, which is centered on the right of the Palestinian people and the refugees to return to their homes and for the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination.